Las Vegas, November 1966. The carpet beneath the audience looked like money, deep red, impossibly soft, swallowing the footsteps of men who thought they owned the night. Overhead, chandeliers glowed like frozen fireworks, spilling warmth over polished marble and sequined gowns that cost more than most people made in a year. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and champagne promises, every table packed with high rollers who'd flown in from 3 coasts just to watch the King of Cool make magic look accidental. Dean stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that famous half-smile playing at his lips. A rocks glass in his hand that everyone assumed was whiskey, but was actually apple juice. The band swung into Ain't That a Kick in the Head, and the audience leaned forward, ready to be transported by a man who made effortless look like an art form. But something was wrong. Dean's eyes had caught movement at the edge of the golden circle, near the heavy velvet curtains that separated the glittering stage from the service corridors where the real Las Vegas lived. 2 security guards, thick-necked men in cheap suits, were escorting someone out. Not roughly, but firmly. The kind of removal that happens 100 times a night in Vegas, invisible to everyone who matters. The man being removed was older, maybe 60, wearing a faded army jacket that had seen better decades. His shoulders were bent in a way that spoke of carrying weight that never gets put down. On his chest, half hidden by the worn fabric, was a small pin that caught the light. Dean's eyes, trained by years of reading rooms and reading souls, recognized the glint immediately. A Purple Heart. The band kept playing. The audience kept laughing at a joke Dean couldn't remember telling. But Dean Martin, the man who built an empire on never letting them see him sweat, had already left the building in every way that mattered. His body stayed on stage, his mouth kept moving through the familiar lyrics, but his heart had followed that broken soldier toward the exit that led back to the cold desert night. In the casino just outside the showroom doors, there was a different kind of spotlight. It fell harsh and unforgiving on a man the room had decided not to see. He sat alone earlier at a nickel slot machine, a worn duffel bag at his feet, feeding coins with the care of a man counting the last seconds of borrowed time. He wasn't begging, wasn't causing trouble, just existing in a space designed for winners, and his presence was a stain on the immaculate illusion of the Strip. Security had been watching him for hours. They moved in twos, authority wrapped around them like armor, wearing the cold calculation of the house. One of them tapped the veteran on the shoulder with 2 fingers, the way you might tap ash from a cigarette. The man looked up, eyes clouded but still searching for something decent in another human face. "You can't stay here," the guard said. "No malice, just policy. Management doesn't want this." On the floor. This meant the smell of the streets. This meant the ache of a country that had sent him to hell and offered him a slot machine on the way back. This meant the fragile, broken part of America that didn't fit the brochure. What happened next would become a story that the Sands management tried to bury for decades. The kind of story that doesn't fit the narrative of Vegas as a playground where everyone's welcome as long as their money's green. The kind of story that revealed something about Dean Martin that his carefully constructed persona was designed to hide, beneath the cool, beneath the jokes, beneath the effortless swing. There lived a man who couldn't stomach watching the powerful crush the powerless. The casino had made a calculation that night. They'd looked at a homeless veteran named William Patterson and decided he was bad for business. They'd looked at Dean Martin and assumed he wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, or wouldn't risk his lucrative contract over a stranger. They were wrong on all 3 counts. From the far end of the corridor, Dean saw it happening. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He just stopped walking. And when Dean Martin stopped in a Las Vegas casino, the entire night shifted on its axis. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out something far more powerful than a fist or a raised voice. A contract. Thick, official, still warm from the day's negotiations. The document that made the casino millions and made Dean look immortal under those showroom lights. He held it up between 2 fingers, looked at the security guards, and spoke quietly. "Either he stays, or I don't." Then, page by page, down the center, he ripped his own contract in half, letting the pieces fall to the carpet that smelled like money, and now, suddenly, like consequences. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that November night in 1966, when a homeless veteran almost disappeared, and Dean Martin quietly refused to let him vanish. The room sounded expensive long before you ever laid eyes on it. The low murmur of high-stakes conversation at the baccarat tables, the crisp snap of cards meeting felt, the thin, relentless chime of slot machines paying out just enough to keep hope alive. Above it all, muffled but insistent, the bass notes from the showroom thumped like a second heartbeat through the walls of the Sands Hotel. That November night in 1966, every sound whispered the same promise. This is where the winners live, where reality bends to accommodate desire, where the desert outside might as well be another planet. The Sands wasn't just a casino, it was a kingdom built on illusion, where every surface gleamed with the promise that you could reinvent yourself if you had enough money and enough nerve. Dean Martin owned this kingdom in every way that mattered. His contract was worth millions, a figure that made casino executives salivate and competitors weep. Every night his name went up on the marquee. The Copa room sold out within hours. High rollers flew in from 3 coasts just to watch him make magic look accidental, to witness the effortless religion of American cool with Dean as its high priest. But near the heavy velvet curtains that separated the showroom from the service corridors, a cocktail waitress named Rita Morales had been watching a different kind of performance. For 3 hours, she'd observed a man at a nickel slot machine, feeding coins with the careful deliberation of someone for whom each quarter represented a choice between eating and hoping. His army jacket was faded to the color of old newspapers, worn thin at the elbows. On his chest, partially hidden by a fold in the material, a small pin caught the light whenever he moved. Rita had been serving drinks in Vegas for 12 years, long enough to recognize a Purple Heart when she saw one. His name was William Patterson, though nobody in that golden room knew it yet. When Rita had brought him a beer hours earlier, he'd nursed it like communion wine, telling her in a voice that still carried command, despite the rasp that he'd seen Dean perform once before at a USO show in France in 1945. 3 weeks before his unit walked into an ambush that killed 42 men and left him with shrapnel in his spine and nightmares that never stopped. He just wanted to hear that voice again, the one that had made 1,000 scared boys forget they were about to die. The floor manager had spotted the jacket, the worn boots, the glitch in his perfect system. The signal was given, subtle, a nod across the crowded room that summoned 2 security guards from the wings. They moved with the quiet efficiency of undertakers, flanking the old soldier on both sides. Their words were polite on the surface but carried the weight of institutional authority underneath. You have to go. You can't be here. You are disturbing the guests. William didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just nodded, his shoulders slumping as familiar shame washed over him, the weight of a country that didn't know what to do with its broken heroes. On stage, Dean was midway through a ballad, his eyes scanning the dark room the way they always did, reading the energy, looking for connection. His life had trained him to listen horizontally, not just forward, to notice the unspoken, the broken, the things people tried to bury under noise. That's when he saw it, the glint of light off metal on the old man's lapel, the 2 guards gripping weathered arms, the resignation in a veteran's posture. In that split second, the king of cool vanished. The act, the slurred speech, the wobbling stance, the carefree playboy persona evaporated instantly. Dean Martin went still. He stopped singing mid-verse. The band, trained to follow his every breath, trailed off into confused silence. The laughter died. The clinking of glasses stopped. For the first time all night, The only sound in the Copper room was the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who had decided he had seen enough. Dean lowered the microphone to his side, stepped off the stage, and began walking toward the back of the room, not as a performer, but as a man moving toward a fight he hadn't started, but was absolutely going to finish. The sounds of Steubenville, Ohio were different from Vegas in every way that mattered. No orchestras, no clinking champagne glasses, no murmured promises of easy money. Just the relentless roar of steel mills that painted the sky orange and coated everything in a fine layer of industrial dust. Trains screamed through the rail yards, carrying away whatever prosperity the working men could carve out with their bleeding hands. On Sunday mornings, church bells fought to rise above the metallic thunder, fragile notes of hope against the grinding machinery of survival. This was the world that forged Dino Cricchetti, son of Gaetano, an Italian immigrant barber whose small shop on South 6th Street smelled permanently of talcum powder and broken dreams. Young Dean wore the same shirt to school 3 days running sometimes, not from neglect, but from necessity. He learned early that poverty has a smell, a look, a way of marking you that no amount of scrubbing can erase. At 12, he was working in the mills before dawn, his small hands blistering on tools meant for grown men, earning pennies he'd hand to his father with a pride that hurt more than the burns. The lesson that carved itself deepest into his soul happened on an ordinary Saturday in 1930, a day that should have disappeared into childhood memory except for what it taught him about dignity and power. Dean and his father had saved for weeks to celebrate his mother's birthday at a downtown restaurant, a place with white tablecloths and waiters in pressed jackets. They walked in wearing their best clothes, which weren't good enough, carrying their best hope, which shattered the moment the manager appeared. The words were polite on the surface, but carried a cruelty Dean would remember for 50 years. "We're fully booked. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." The manager didn't look at them. He looked through them, pointing toward the door with the practiced dismissal of a man who'd done this many times before. Dean watched his father's shoulders slump, watched the light die in Gaetano's eyes, witnessed the terrible, silent swallowing of pride, just to survive the moment without a scene. They left without argument, his mother's face carefully blank, his father's jaw tight with swallowed rage. Walking home that day, his father spoke words that would become Dean's private constitution. In broken English that carried more wisdom than poetry, Gaetano told his son there were two kinds of men in this world: those who use power to make others feel small, and those who use whatever power they have to ensure no one else feels the way they felt walking out of that restaurant. In that moment, 12-year-old Dino Cricchetti made a blood oath in the silence of his humiliated heart. He would build armor so bright, so charming, so untouchable that no one could ever look down on him again. But more importantly, he swore he would never be the man pointing at the door. This became the secret engine of his life. Years later, Jerry Lewis would witness Dean's invisible charity. The hundreds slipped to struggling stagehands. The hospital bills paid for strangers, always with the strict instruction that his name never be mentioned. He didn't want applause for his kindness. He just wanted to balance the scales. He couldn't fix the world that broke his father's heart, but he could ensure that in his presence, nobody felt small. So when Dean Martin crossed the plush carpet of the Sands that November night in 1966, he wasn't just walking toward a security disturbance. He was walking back through time, back to that restaurant doorway, back to the moment he promised himself that if he ever had the power, he'd use it to protect the powerless. The distance between the stage and the exit was only 50 feet, but Dean covered a lifetime in those steps. The corridor outside the Copper room hummed with the mechanical heartbeat of money being made. Away from the orchestrated magic of the showroom, you could hear the real sounds of the Sands, the distant clatter of chips hitting felt, the whispered calculations of pit bosses, the low static of security radios crackling half-heard instructions. It was the sound of a machine that measured everything in profit and loss, where human dignity was just another variable in an equation that always balanced in favor of the house. Dean's polished shoes made a deliberate rhythm against the carpet as he crossed that space, each step a countdown to something irreversible. The two guards had almost reached the exit with William Patterson when Dean's hand landed on one of their shoulders, not rough or theatrical, just there with the weight of absolute certainty. The guard turned, recognition flooding his face with the particular panic of a man caught between policy and power. "He stays," Dean said quietly, his voice stripped of every ounce of the charming drunk act that had made him millions. No negotiation in those words, no wiggle room, just the flat declaration of a man who had made his decision. Vincent Torino, the floor manager, arrived in a rush of cologne and mounting dread. He'd navigated the delicate politics of high rollers and mob money for 8 years, but this situation was spiraling into territory no manual could cover. Behind him, the showroom doors stood open, and through them came the muffled sound of an audience beginning to murmur, wondering why their entertainment had suddenly abandoned them mid-song. Torino's voice came out smooth as aged whiskey, his hands already raised in appeasement. "Mr. Martin, please, there's been a misunderstanding. This gentleman was asked to relocate to a more appropriate area. We have protocols about guest comfort. The high rollers at Table 7 complained. Surely you understand." Dean didn't move, didn't blink, his eyes completely sober and present. "If he goes, I go. Not just tonight. Ever." The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Torino's mind raced through calculations that would have made an accountant weep. Dean's contract was worth $3 million over 18 months. The showroom was sold out through next summer. Without Dean, the entire glittering empire could crumble. William Patterson shifted between them, trying to make himself smaller, already moving toward the door. "Mister, I don't want no trouble," he said softly. "They're right. I ain't got the clothes for a place like this." Dean's hand landed gently but firmly on the old soldier's arm. "You fought for this country?" When Patterson nodded, Dean's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Then you earned the right to be here more than any of us." Torino tried compromise, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "We can arrange a suite for this gentleman, a meal, anything he needs, just not in the showroom during the performance." Dean turned without a word and walked toward the backstage area. When he returned 2 minutes later, he was holding his contract, the thick document that guaranteed his immortality under those showroom lights, that represented security his 12-year-old self could never have imagined. He held it up so everyone could see, looked directly at Torino, and then slowly, deliberately, tore it down the center. The sound of ripping paper was violent and sharp, louder than a gunshot in the hushed corridor. Page after page, he tore through the terms and conditions of his golden cage, letting the pieces fall to the carpet like snow made of consequences. "Either he stays," Dean said again, softer now, "or I don't." The manager looked at the torn paper, then at the sold-out crowd waiting in the dark, and finally at the face of the man who generated more revenue than the gaming tables combined. The calculation took less than a second. "All right. He stays." Dean didn't just let William stay. He took the man's arm and guided him past the stunned security team, past the gaping high rollers, all the way to the center table reserved for studio heads and mob bosses. He seated the homeless veteran right there in the heart of the golden circle, ordered the best whiskey in the house, and walked back to the stage. When he picked up the microphone again, he simply said, "This next song is for my friend Bill." And for the rest of the night, the King of Cool sang for an audience of one. The silence that settled over the sands that night felt different from the usual post-show emptiness. You could still hear the mechanical heartbeat of the casino, chips clicking against felt, ice cubes settling in abandoned drinks, the distant hum of slot machines paying out hope in measured doses. But underneath it all was something new, fragile as spun glass. The sound of a world that had shifted slightly on its axis because one man refused to look away from another man's pain. Dean didn't retreat to his dressing room to bask in the applause that still echoed from the Copa room. Instead, he sat down at that center table next to William Patterson, loosened his tie, and ordered 2 cups of coffee as if they were old friends catching up at a neighborhood diner. No entourage, no photographers, no casino executives hovering for a photo opportunity. Just 2 men talking in low voices while the golden room emptied around them. Their conversation a private ceremony of recognition between souls who understood the weight of carrying invisible wounds. What they discussed would never be fully recorded, but fragments survived in the memory of Rita, the cocktail waitress who lingered nearby, and in the careful observations of a busboy who swept a little slower than usual. Patterson spoke in careful bursts about places in France with names that tasted like smoke, about bridges that never should have been crossed, about men he remembered by the way they laughed before the world swallowed them whole. Dean listened without interruption, without jokes, without the performative charm that had made him millions. He just listened, as if every word was something precious that might break if handled carelessly. Before the night ended, Dean made a phone call that nobody witnessed and no gossip columnist would ever transform into currency. By sunrise, the man who had been sleeping in alleys behind the Strip was waking up in a suite on the 14th floor of the Sands, surrounded by fresh linens that smelled of possibility instead of despair. Dean had paid for the room personally, a month in advance, cash that left no paper trail connecting back to the casino's accounting department. Over the following weeks, Dean became a master of invisible generosity. He made calls to veteran services that had ignored Patterson's paperwork for 2 years, and suddenly those forms moved to the top of bureaucratic piles. He connected the old soldier with a doctor who specialized in treating shrapnel injuries, arranging appointments that somehow never generated bills. He worked through back channels to secure Patterson a modest apartment in Henderson, paid for through a trust that bore no connection to his famous name. 3 times during that month, Dean visited Patterson's suite. Conversations that happened behind closed doors with no witnesses, no recording, no documentation. These weren't publicity stunts or charity photo opportunities. They were acts of communion between 2 men who understood that some wounds never fully heal. They just learned to live quietly beneath the surface. The ripple from that torn contract spread through the ecosystem of Las Vegas entertainment like a stone dropped in still water. Other performers heard whispers of the story in dressing rooms and makeup chairs. Frank Sinatra, learning about it over late-night drinks, reportedly went silent for a long moment before quietly instructing his own security detail to show more consideration for the drifters who sometimes wandered into his venues. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a recalibration of what power meant and how it should be used. Patterson lived another 30 years after that November night, remarried at 63, became a grandfather, built a small, quiet life that would have been impossible without Dean's intervention. He carried a photograph of Dean Martin in his wallet until the leather wore thin, showing it to younger veterans struggling with their own demons, offering proof that somebody important had given a damn. In 2015, Patterson's grandson Michael was cleaning out his grandfather's apartment when he found a journal spanning 3 decades. The entries all circled back to the same gravitational center, November 1966, the night a famous man chose dignity over dollars, the night William Patterson's life split into before and after. On the final page, in handwriting that had grown stronger over the years, his grandfather had written the truth that would outlive all the songs and movies. He saved my life. Not because he gave me money, but because he looked at me when everyone else looked away. The sound of a door closing quietly can be heavier than a slam, and after that November night, doors began closing for Dean Martin with the soft, inexorable weight of judgment. The sand still hummed with its familiar symphony of wealth and want, dice cracking against green felt, ice settling in abandoned cocktails, the distant murmur of men betting against odds that never favored them. But underneath the mechanical heartbeat of the casino, something fundamental had shifted. The air itself felt different, charged with the kind of tension that comes when power has been challenged and is quietly, methodically planning its response. The punishment came not with fanfare, but with the clinical precision of a surgeon making careful cuts. Dean's Saturday night prime slots gradually migrated to Thursday evenings, a shift so subtle it could be explained as scheduling flexibility. Promotional budgets that once flooded newspapers and radio waves with his name began to thin like blood and water. The little courtesies that had signaled his absolute power, reserved tables held indefinitely, comps approved with a nod, phone calls returned within the hour, suddenly required explanations, approvals, the bureaucratic friction that reminds kings they still need the kingdom's permission to rule. The casino management couldn't fire their golden goose, the man whose name on the marquee guaranteed packed houses and flowing champagne. But they could make the cage smaller, degree by degree, until even the king of cool felt the walls closing in. It was a war of attrition designed to bleed him slowly, to remind him that moral courage in Las Vegas came with a price tag that kept accumulating interest. Dean absorbed every slight with the same stoic grace he brought to everything else, but the cost was settling deep in his bones, like sediment in still water. His daughter Diana would later remember finding him during those months, sitting alone in their den long after the house had gone quiet, still wearing his stage clothes, but staring at the dark television screen with eyes that looked exhausted in a way sleep couldn't touch. The effortless cool that came so naturally under the lights required enormous effort to maintain in a world that constantly tested whether he'd compromised the principles that defined him. Being Dean Martin was like being a tightrope walker who could never admit he was afraid of heights. Frank could explode in volcanic rage and be forgiven by sunrise because everyone expected tempests from Sinatra. Sammy could be vulnerable and beautifully complicated because his talent transcended every contradiction. But Dean had built his empire on being unshakable, and the cost of that fortress was a loneliness that few could understand. The drunk act that had once been clever protection hardened around him like armor, giving him a place to hide his sensitivity while the world applauded his apparent indifference. This incident fit into a larger pattern that Dean worked hard to keep invisible. He couldn't perform in segregated venues even when it cost him lucrative contracts. He walked off sets when directors treated extras like furniture. He paid hospital bills for injured crew members through anonymous channels that left no trail back to his generosity. Each principled stand carved away a little more of his commercial viability, but also added another stone to the invisible load he carried as the self-appointed guardian of decency in their glittering, heartless world. In Patterson's journal, discovered decades later, there was an entry that captured the hidden cost of being everyone's idea of effortless. It described a moment during one of Dean's private visits when the mask had slipped completely. He looked tired. Patterson wrote in careful handwriting, "Not sleepy tired, but soul tired. He told me sometimes he feels like he's holding up the sky, and nobody notices because he makes it look like he's just leaning against a wall." The sound of old paper unfolding carries decades inside it, a whisper that grows louder with each crease, smoothed flat. When Michael Patterson found the letter in 2015, tucked between the final pages of his grandfather's journal, it had the weight of something that had been waiting 49 years to be discovered. The envelope bore no postmark, no stamp, just his grandfather's name written in elegant script across cream-colored Sands Hotel stationery. Inside, the ink had faded to the color of old tea, but the words remained sharp enough to cut. Dean had delivered this letter personally during his final visit to William's suite in December 1966, pressing it into the old soldier's hands with instructions to read it later. When the noise of gratitude had settled into something quieter, it wasn't meant for immediate consumption. It was meant to be a private conversation between two men who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds in a world that demanded they smile while bleeding. "Dear Bill," it began, the handwriting looser than his usual careful script, as if he'd written it late at night when the performance finally ended. "You thanked me for saving you, but you got it backward, pal. When I saw you sitting there with that purple heart, you reminded me of something I'd been forgetting in this town full of mirrors. You reminded me why any of this matters." The letter revealed what Dean had never told another soul, that he'd been drowning in slow motion, suffocating under the weight of being everyone's fantasy while losing track of his own humanity. The casinos wanted the charming drunk who made millions look like pocket change. The studios wanted the smooth operator who never broke character. The world wanted the man who made everything look effortless, who never revealed the machinery grinding away behind that famous half-smile. But seeing Patterson being escorted toward the exit had cracked something open inside him, a recognition that ran deeper than sympathy. Both men had served their country in different uniforms, one in trenches, one in tuxedos, both carrying burdens they couldn't put down, both struggling with a world that wanted them to be something they fundamentally weren't. The difference was that Patterson's service had been honest and visible, while Dean's had become a performance so convincing he sometimes forgot where the act ended and the man began. "You reminded me that dignity isn't something they give you," Dean wrote in careful script. "It's something you keep. Thank you for your service, to your country and to me. You saved me that night as much as I saved you." Tucked behind the letter was a photograph, its edges soft from 3 decades pressed against wallet leather. It showed Dean and Bill sitting at a small table in that hotel suite, neither of them performing for an audience. Dean wasn't wearing his famous half-smile. He was listening, his face open and serious, his hand resting gently on Bill's arm. On the back, in that same elegant handwriting, was a simple inscription to Bill, a real hero. "Your friend always, Dean." That photograph was the final piece of evidence that the greatest performance of Dean Martin's life wasn't sung on any stage or captured by any camera. It was the choice he made on a November night in 1966 to stop the music, tear up a contract, and stand beside a man everyone else had decided was disposable. The spotlight that night hadn't just illuminated entertainment, it had illuminated the character of a man who understood that true immortality isn't measured in records sold or movies made, but in the quiet moments when you choose dignity over convenience, when you decide to be decent rather than simply cool.